Okay. Nice day. Nice day to be doing this. And welcome to JEHC. We are going to be continuing our discussion on independent front suspension design. And today we're going to be focused on shock and bump stuff, and then we'll go into some vertical, horizontal bearing stuff. So this might be a short one. I've said it before, but then again, these end up always dragging out to a few hours. I believe this is episode 4. Number 3 was on the steering stuff. And so, yeah, and just a few things real quick. We've had people message me about donating to the podcast. I am familiar with that is a thing. I do know that there's people that do that. I am not going to do that. I do not need no donations. Thank you. I appreciate that. But I think that's kind of silly to some degree. I do this on my own, and that's just how it's going to be. We also don't have sponsors. I have my own stuff, which I, obviously do a horrible job of promoting, but to fulfill my contractual obligation and justify the sponsorship expense with the wife, I at least push some of the products and make it clear that I do have the DIY, off-road stuff, tech consulting, things like that. But, it fucking irks me when you see these guys that have money or claim to have money, claim to be ballers or whatever the fuck, and then they go and start these podcasts and they're basically like one sponsor after another, whether it's like a seat company or this or that bullshit. And it's like, motherfucker, you're claiming you got the money to like buy fucking X, Y, and Z, and then you're still like trying to hustle like fucking sponsors on your podcast or shit. Like, it's just so inauthentic and cheesy and fucking lame that like you can't put together $5 or $6 grand to buy the right equipment and do this correctly. And like, you don't need fucking sponsors. Like, if you're buying race trucks or you're racing or doing anything like that, like, you have plenty of disposable income to be doing any of this. You don't need to be trying to fucking hustle these hardworking business owners and companies in our industry to try and get some sort of cheese dick sponsorship from company X, Y, or Z so you can, promote them on your podcast like you're some sort of fucking rad motherfucker that just gets all these, all these sponsors are just trying to suck my dick, and I have to fucking, it's just so much that, bro, I just have to fucking talk about them. And it's just so inauthentic and stupid, and it fucking drives me up the wall with the people in our industry that put these podcasts together or put this content out with like these sponsorship things, and it's not rad, and it's so inauthentic that I feel like for the most part people see right through that shit. It just really makes you look like a dipshit more than anything. So with that said, let's grotesquely promote my own product. So today we're going to be featuring billet link mounts that I sell on DIY. This is just a real simple thing that we do. And I have them in 3 sizes, although I do know that the 4-inch ones are currently out of stock. They are not listed on the site, but we have 3 1/4 and 3 1/2 inch. And again, it's just stuff like this that, we're self-made, truly self-made, not like the fake motherfuckers that tattoo self-made on their knuckles while fucking over investor after investor. We just do our own thing. And so it's just crap like this. And we don't make a lot of money off this, but I've always wanted to do a podcast, and I make 0 money off this. It's a total fucking expense. But for the most part, I enjoy this, and I like to make cool stuff like this. So the digital asset website, which is DIY Off-Road, I do have a few of these parts that complement people's builds. And one of them are these billet link mounts. It's all 4130. The plate work is 4130, and they are just completely stout. You're not going to tear this fucking mount, so to speak. Like, if you tear this, in other words, the 3/4 inch bolt, even if it's coming from RPI, is going to fail before the mount fails. And so if you tear that, you got some serious problems, But yeah, so just something that we do, real simple. Now I can fulfill my contractual obligation for this evening's podcast. And then that way the sponsorship expenditures with the wife are going to go over just fine. And everyone's fucking happy, But yeah, so it's my own little things here or there. And it's just stuff that I've always kind of wanted to make, and I like making this type of stuff. We don't have fuckloads of margin, obviously. If you saw the pricing, you know how this stuff makes. I machine, decent sized runs of them. like those tabs, I'll do a few hundred at a time and things like that, to where I can get, an okay margin in it. And at the same time, like, I can offer decent pricing and not fucking gouge people. But like, I can't give this shit away and sponsor people. Like, I have fucking kids to feed and a wife to answer to. So, I ain't trying to sponsor every Tom, Dick, and Harry and give this shit away. We just make, a pretty honest margin on this type of stuff, and we slang it here or there in sort of a modest fashion. Like, I don't really promote it other than sometimes on this podcast and things like that. But if you're watching this and you're into this episode, there's a high probability you already know that I have tech consulting and I have DIY off-road. I'm still working on DIY muscle car. And so you already know what those businesses are and things like that. And so if we work with you, cool. If we don't, whatever. It is what it is. So at the same time, there's a fuckload of other people that make a lot of other cool shit, and I try to do my best to push their stuff too and showcase other examples other than my own stuff in these podcasts, because I am by no means the only one or the godsend or God's gift to the industry, because there's just so many fucking talented people and so much cool stuff. So I feel like that's never going to end or change, because the industry is constantly in a competitive state, hence, racing, etc., to where, like, we're always having new builders pop up and new products being designed and new vehicles to design for, especially in the UTV side of industry. And so we'll see. I'm going to have some guests coming up here in the next few weeks, etc. Start talking about other facets and other sides of the industry, other than, some of the stuff that I personally deal with and things like that, to get some other perspectives and input and hopefully some history into some of the engineering side of this industry that unfortunately has been forgotten and or ignored by a lot of people, because it doesn't really get clicks on YouTube. So it is what it is to some degree. But let's move forward. So tonight we're going to be continuing on the independent front suspension stuff, and that is going to entail shock and bump layout stuff. And then we'll talk about some vertical and horizontal bearing caveats with fabrication of arms. So let's get this ball rolling. We'll click over. Yeah. First and foremost, I totally stumbled on this. Well, no, I've watched a bunch of shock therapy stuff, but I did stumble on this video about the UTV stuff per se. And this is Justin. And I got to call this out because it's so, like, he butchers this shit. He's so fucking wrong on what motion ratio is and what is actually how it's even calculated or understood to some degree. And it's fascinating being a self-proclaimed shock guru and to just fucking butcher this entirely. So a lot of his videos are great. I've done business with shock therapy, to be fair, and that was a good experience. I'll still buy stuff from them, but holy fuck, dude, this may not have been a good video for him to make, because it just completely annihilates the fundamental understanding of what the fuck shock geometry, mounting, and design incorporation into, like, the systems and stuff like that. He completely conflates and ignores what motion ratio calculations are, and starts talking about the progressive aspect of shock lean as if that's the fucking motion ratio. And now, granted, he's correct in that it's an aspect of motion ratio, but it is the small side of the input for motion ratio. The much larger side would be the calculation for the distance on the arm relative. And here's the part. It's like I feel kind of bad for calling him out on this and what I'm about to review, but the reality here is, like, this is just bad information, and it's fucking wrong. It's completely ass backwards. And it blows me away, being the shock dude. But at the same time, like, I figured out who this fucking guy was. This is the Revenge Racing Sandcar guy from, like, 2006, 7, 8, like, back then. If you guys remember that name and understand what I'm referring to, like, yeah, you fucking get it. So I don't feel that bad calling him out for that aspect. But let's review what. So you could watch this video and then watch what I'm about to go through for motion ratio, etc., and you'll understand exactly what I mean by it. Unfortunately, he's just fucking butchers that. So yeah, welcome to the Thunderdome. Let me pull up my zip drive real quick so I can get some of this going. Shocks. Stage 1. Motion ratio 1. I think this is the first slide I want to show. Yeah, perfect. Here we go. Okay. So what he completely, unfortunately, ignores, doesn't know, doesn't understand, whatever the fuck you want to call it, is motion ratio starts with this measurement here, which is the red relative to the green. The green is obviously going to be my pivot point. This is a lower arm. Shouldn't have to fucking explain it, just so we're clear. The green is the overall length of this lower arm. The red is the length from the chassis pivot to where the shock is mounted on this lower arm. Now, this is going to create a ratio. We'll call it a percentage. In this specific example, I think we're about 60%, roughly, maybe a hair more. We're in that range. And most big truck type stuff is going to be like 55% on the low side, and then probably like 75 to 80% on the high side. And we'll review some of those because there is definitely a variance between the builders and philosophies and things like that. But the point is, if you're trying to figure out the efficiency of the shock or the motion ratio, which is actually the piston speed relative to the wheel speed. And when I say wheel speed, I'm not referring to rolling forward. I am referring to movement in the suspension system travel. So if I have 24 inches of wheel travel and a 14-inch stroke shock, that means inherently the shock piston speed is roughly going to be a little over, under that, like 1.2, because you're at the 14-inch stroke, you're going to be at like this, like a 60% range. So in other words, the piston in the shock is moving at a different rate than the tire because you're using 14 inches of stroke to get you 24 inches of wheel travel. So the tire, in essence, is going to be moving more than every inch of stroke of shock. So for 1 inch stroke of shock, you're going to be close to 2 inches. You're going to be like 1.8 inches of movement on the tire. Now, these are a little bit of a generalization, but the point being is this is where Justin unfortunately just completely misses the boat. When you speak motion ratio and you're talking about the efficiency of the shock in the system, this is the first and more important calculation, so to speak. The lean of the shock is the secondary aspect and calculation that would then come into play for the motion ratio, and that typically is going to be more of a progressive aspect of this ratio here. So first and foremost, fundamentally, you're going to have to figure out where you're going to be on the arm relative to these distances, the red relative to the green, and what percentage you sit at first. And the lean comes second. So most of that motion ratio is calculated by this specific percent. Then you have to factor in the lean, and that can change the progressiveness, so to speak, of the motion ratio. So he does somewhat get that correct in the progressive side of it, and we can go into that. But the point being here is when you're dealing with motion ratio, this is the fundamental measurement you need to start with and you need to understand first and foremost. Because it's the lean part of it will grant you some flexibility with obtaining higher travel numbers for that stroke of shock, or not per se, because and I'll get into that in a second. But in this, if I were to have the red line measurement match the green, that is literally a 1-to-1 motion ratio, i.e. that bearing pivot that's on center point of the wheel and hub assembly is moving in travel the same amount as the shock stroke. Now, in a perfect world, it would be like, well, fuck yeah, why don't we have that? The shock would be at its most efficient state, so to speak, in that aspect. And the reality is it's packaging constraints. It's just fucking impossible, both with the rear suspension and the front suspension. I mean, if you think about it, for the front of these big trucks, you need a 24-inch shock. That shock would be in the fucking, roof. It would be like so far above the hood. It would just be insane. So when it comes to big stuff like trophy trucks, class ones that run trophy truck-esque suspension, and I'll get into some of those variances too, they're going to be typically like 14-inch stroke shocks, almost all of them for the most part. There are a few trucks I've seen that have dabbled with 16-inch stroke shocks, and there are a few that dabble with 12-inch stroke shocks. But if you're building a big truck, full-size track width truck, so 89 inches plus in track width, and you're running 12-inch stroke shocks, and you're still trying to pull 24 inches of wheel travel, you're you're in a world of hurt. That's a very bad motion ratio right off the bat. I don't give a fuck what you do on the lean side. You need to be on a 14-inch stroke shock, realistically speaking, to put you into what would be considered a competitive motion ratio area on big truck stuff. Now, when it comes to long travel-based stuff, this motion ratio calculation is the same thing. On a long travel arm, obviously the arms are a lot shorter. We can't get as long a lower arms in long travel applications, but that doesn't change how we would calculate this specific percentage. You know, if you have a 10-inch stroke shock on a long travel kit that's pulling 16 inches and change, that shock most likely is going to be in the 60, 65 percentile, maybe 70 percentile of the arm on this motion ratio calculation that I'm showing here on screen. So this is, unfortunately, like I said, where Justin completely fucking butchered this aspect. And this is, in my opinion, the foremost, most fucking important part to start when it comes to shock geometry. The next is going to be what we call the lean. Some people start this at the 90-degree rule and things like that. But I just wanted to get you guys into a fundamental understanding of where this motion ratio and sort of this percentages and understanding of shock piston speed relative to wheel speed or travel relate. And when it comes to this dimension here on the screen, that's your first and foremost starting point. And then from there, we can dive into the other aspects like lean. Okay. So, let's dive into... Yeah, I have a ton of fucking pictures and stuff to go through. So just give me one sec to review. See, I haven't. Okay, so there's another one. Okay, cool. So this is this picture here on the top. Let's get this guy in the. I can zoom all the way in. There we go. Look at that. So this picture here. This is a T4 truck that I have designed. And this is at full compression. So what you're seeing here is our lower arm right here. And this is our shock. Now, there's definitely some debate in this. But the reality here is there's this thing about the 90-degree rule. And what they say is your shock can't go past 90 degrees at compression. And like that's the best route to mount the shock. And for the most part, it's kind of okay, but it's also just total bullshit. Total fucking bullshit. So the guys that are telling you if you don't mount your shocks at 90 degrees and you have digression in the shock system, they're fucking wrong. They don't know what they're talking about. And if the shock tuner is telling you that you have to do that or this and that, they're just a shitty fucking shock tuner. That's just the bottom line. Because the fastest, best handling trucks in... the game, so to speak, do run digression, whether it's a few degrees, etc. Some are a little bit more than others. But at the same time, there's also incredibly fast trucks that do not run digression, run the inverse of that. And I'm going to show you examples of both. I'll also show you, an example of what the late, great John Markingwich said, which is you can run up to 15 degrees of digression and it have like zero fucking effect on the speed and performance of the vehicle. So if you don't believe me or you think I'm full of shit, well... Good luck trying to debate some of the examples I'm about to pull up. But the point being here is this 90-degree rule, which is, putting this at 90 degrees at compression is like, quote unquote, the only way to do it. And if you don't, and if you have digression, you're fucking wrong, so to speak, is inherently fucking wrong. That's just the case. And it also, kind of is like one of those red flags where, individuals like myself or other designers, they're doing this type of stuff on a daily basis and run into these situations that I'm about to review and go through. If you're sticking to that, 90-degree rule is the only way to do things, that's kind of a red flag in that, like, you basically have disclosed your lack of experience or expertise in understanding these chassis, their dynamics, and setups. And not to mention the variations of trucks that... for obvious reasons, do not abide by that, yet still fucking win and are some of the best handling, fastest trucks there are. And so by default, that means that whole 90-degree rule just went right out the fucking window. And yeah, again, you can totally debate that and things like that, but I'd rather focus on real-world results than the hypothetical keyboard fucking warriors or the guys that have never really designed a lot of vehicles and things like that just start, shouting off their mouth or some bullshit because their fucking bro shock tuner told them that, oh, if it has digression, it's fucking wrong. You need to cut it all out and this and that. And like, obviously you don't pay attention to anyone winning races. So for that reason, like I'm saying, 90-degree rule, totally bullshit. Don't stress yourself on that. Now, with that said, do I prefer to keep stuff in the more progressive side? And we can draw a quick diagram just so that I don't get too many people confused on this. Because I am going a little bit fast through this. I think I have paint on here. Yeah, here we go, paint. So, let me see if I can do some fucking wizardry right now. Pull this in from zip drive. Oh, and another thing too, real quick. I have had questions on the layouts. So I think what's going to happen, I'm sorry, not the layouts, but the outline for these episodes. So this is episode 4. But what I'm going to do is, once I'm through this pack, this is like the first independent front suspension pack that I'm going through. And after today, let's see. I will have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'll have 6 more pages to go through after today. And I'm going to go and put these outlines for each specific volume. I might just put like a page on DIY's website where I will have these as like a PDF you can download. I've had a bunch of people ask, and I will do that. And so I will break the outline up into each volume and make it to where it's like totally understandable for everyone and easy to go through. And so at that point, then you could just download the PDFs for each volume with the outline, so to speak. And I think that'll make things a little bit less confusing for some, and hopefully make it to where you can understand which volume has which information, so to speak, if that's the stuff you were looking for and wanting to review. So yeah, just real quick, I just wanted to address that because I had a bunch of people ask me. But let's go through shock geometry. Oh, fuck. Now I got to figure out which fucking one it is. Cycle steering, CPTC. We'll do that one. Okay, so this is what we were just looking at. Cool. Okay. Now, we're going to get some fucking doodlies. Use some red on here. So this is what I mean by the 90-degree rule. This point right here, let me see if I can do this, to that guy is our lower arm, right? And 90 degrees is the shock mount coming straight off. Now you'll notice I did draw this line to where it's not following the shock that's in the picture. That's because this front end does run digression. But just so we're clear, the 90-degree rule, so to speak, refers to this. This arm is at compression, and you go 90 degrees from that, and that's where you quote-unquote should mount the shock or inboard of that. That is what's considered the 90-degree rule. That's considered progressive shock. I'm sorry, a progressive shock geometry. When the shock is mounted outboard of that, like I have it in this example, it's about 3 degrees of digression, 3.5, maybe 4 degrees of digression. It's somewhere in that range. So if the shock was mounted over here, like this red line that I'm putting in right now, or over here, those would be progressive shock mounting locations. And as you go further inboard, you're creating that lean that people refer to, shock lean, etc. And this is very common on UTVs and things like that. And I'll dive into the reasons why. Those are fucking stupid, but done that way. And I'll also review some others. But I just want you to understand what the 90-degree rule is and what this digressive versus non-digressive stuff is. Now, with that said, I do want to bring this up because I do remember this. Stewart's Raceworks. Now, clearly, these trucks handle like shit because, people keep fucking buying them like crazy. But this is something from a while ago that Craig posted, and it's just we'll call it some reassurance so that, like, You don't have to take my word for it. I'm not like a fucking crazy person. Look at the rear of this. Look at how fucking digressive this rear is. Now, I know we're focusing on front, but the point here is this is digressive as shit. The other point here is, there we go. John Marking says you can go 15 degrees past and only lose a super low amount of effect. That is straight from Craig Stewart, the legendary son of the legendary father, referring to the exact same thing I was referring to, that I was told years ago that Marking believed 15 degrees of digression is no fucking problem. Now, 15 degrees is a shitload, to be crystal clear. I have never got to that much digression in a system. I am typically like here, where I'm like 3 or 4 degrees of digression, maybe a little more. So with that said, I just wanted to put that little tidbit to bed. And again, this could also be another red flag from a shock tuner that they're telling you can't have digression. Now, there's reasons why there is digression in these setups, and it's because of packaging constraints. So it's not like I'm intentionally introducing digression or forcefully making the system a digressive state with the shocks. When you're seeing it digressive, most of the time, the builders that I'll be showcasing here in a second and what I'm referring to, it's because of packaging constraints. When you have a motor that's shoved up against the back of that bulkhead and you've got shocks that are sitting right there, you have to have something give. And in these situations, we're fighting with multiple things. We're fighting wheel travel, we're fighting shock placement, shock geometry, and the constraints with the drivetrain package. These are front engine applications, this T4 right here. And I do my best to keep as little amount of digression in the system, but I still have to have some digression, and those fucking shocks are right there on the front of the motor. To be fair, like I'm really hugging it bad, as opposed to some of these other examples I can show. But the point being is, I don't want people to be scared if they end up with digression in their shock geometry, because it's not really a fucking issue. It just really isn't. Now, with that said, I do prefer to get stuff a little bit more progressive when I can. But sometimes you got to have some digression in the system to get everything to work right. And at that point, you really don't need to stress it. Like I just showed you, up to 15 degrees, and 15 degrees is a fuckload. Like this T4 is only at like 3.5 or 3 something. It's very mellow. So again, just I don't want people pulling their fucking hair out thinking they're a complete shit designer because they're stuck with digression, and then they have some fucking other asshole telling them like, oh, you went past 90, you fucked up, blah blah. And it's just like, no, you don't understand enough about the industry, you don't understand enough about the dynamics of these vehicles, etc., to start making those claims. And if someone is making such a bold claim like that, I would definitely question their intellect relative to experience in this industry, because like I said, there's a ton of examples, and let's pull some of those up, because I want you guys to see the differences in this stuff. Let's look for some that are digressive. That would be the opposite. It's progressive. Let's see. So this is a geyser. I do believe this does get a little digressive. Same with like how I had this would be the inverse. We'll go to that in a minute. That's a Huffman deal. Here we go. So here is, again, arguably some of the best handling pre-runners there are, the Weitzel trucks. And these definitely have digression, like in a decent chunk, like 7 or 8 degrees of digression at compression. They are pushing higher numbers of travel. I want to see these are on the 26 to 27 usable wheel travel range with 14-inch stroke shocks. You can see the motion ratio on the arms. They're much closer to 50% mark on these arms with a 14-inch stroke shock. Hence, they're putting themselves in that 26, 27 range. And by default, they are introducing a lot of digression into the system at compression. Again, here's another shot of the Weitzel truck. You can see that is that motion ratio is damn near close to that 50% mark. And if you've ever had a chance to see these things work, these fucking trucks work really well. It is impressive. Here's the shock mounts in the chassis. Look at how fucking wide these are in the chassis. This bolt right here is a shock mount. This bolt right here is a shock mount. And you can just see how fucking wide those are. And I'm going to show you some inverse of these. But right now we're focusing on trucks that have digression in the shock system. And these are arguably the fastest, nicest fucking... Like, I have seen Weitzel pre-runners fucking walk geysers. Now, I don't know the specifics on the drivetrain between those two. This is like 10, 15 years ago. But the point being is, by simply having digression in the system, you can't just write it off as these trucks are fucking slow. Here's a Stewart's. Again, the main top teams are running Stewart's luxury pre-runners, and they are for a reason. If you follow any of Bryce Menzies' YouTube videos, he's got so much fucking content with these pre-runners. It's God, it's fucking it's like a dream. Guys like me dream of this type of stuff because these are the ultimate in all forms of motorsport, in my opinion. Luxury pre-runners are the absolute blend of fucking artistic craftsmanship with the pure brutal fucking gnarliness of a trophy truck. And with that said, like, the Stewart trucks are arguably again some of the best handling trucks, period. And these are why these teams who can easily buy anyone's luxury pre-runner are buying Stewart's. I'd say they are the number one for the big boys, whether it's McMillan or Menzies. And these guys run a fuckload of digression in the system. Look at those shocks. Look at that shock ratio. Let me see if I can find any more Stewart stuff. Here's another Stewart's. Look at that. Dude, that's fucking digressive as fuck at compression. Probably like 8 degrees of digression. And you can see that motion ratio. Look at that motion ratio. They are definitely closer to the 50 percentile on that mark. And again, these are really well-handling trucks. So I just want to put that argument to bed that if you have digression in the shock system, that you fucked up. You definitely did not. So, nip that in the bud. Let's go through some other stuff. Now, let's focus on the entire inverse of that, where it is leaned over, so to speak. Fucking Gordon's truck. I think this is Chet Huffman's truck, to be perfectly honest, right here. The shocks are mounted borderline fucking together, just like a Can-Am X3. This was done many years, a decade plus before a Can-Am X3. And this will be very progressive, this system. It is definitely way inboard of 90 degrees at compression. And this is a rear engine / mid-engine truck. I'm sorry, mid-engine truck, technically. Can't believe I said rear engine. I fucked that up. This is a mid-engine truck. And for that, they do not have any constraint in the compartment there for the drivetrain to where they can mount these shocks inboard like that. Now, the argument could totally be said that this is ideal, and I do like having them more on this range, and I like this as opposed to having the digression. I just wanted to make the point clear that having digression does not inherently mean you did it incorrectly or whatever you want to call it. And so I don't want people to jump all over others because they have digression in their system, when the reality is the best handling trucks out there have digression. So let's go to look at the ratio on the arms for that truck that I just showed you. Here we go. So this is the Chet Huffman truck. This is an OG truck done by Gordon. And you can see the ratio on this fucking arm. Look at that. That's like 75, 80%. So again, these are two extremes, so to speak. The Stewart's and Weitzel guys, they're running down to like the 50 percentile mark, 55 percentile mark, maybe. The Gordon and this Huffman and a few others I'll show you in a second, they're running it up to like a 75, 80% mark on that lower arm motion ratio. Now, granted, I'm referring to that as the lower arm motion ratio because the total motion ratio does have to factor in to the lean of that. Now, the cool thing with this is as you move outboard on the arm, you are going to decrease the amount of wheel travel you can get with the same shock. I kind of hinted at that earlier. So if I have a 14-inch stroke shock at 50%, theoretically, I'm going to be at 20% at the bearing moving on the arm, which is the wheel center line. And so, so 14 will be 28 there. And then, in theory, if you're at 50%, right? Let's ignore the other numbers. And so as I start moving that up, it's going to be reducing it all the way. If I move that shock all the way to where the bearing is, where the green matches the red, Sorry, the green matches the red. That's a 1-to-1. So 14-inch stroke to 14 inches of wheel travel. So by moving it back, I can gain that wheel travel with the stroke of the shock. Now, as you move outboard, like in this example here, the way you can add extra wheel travel, so to speak, is by leaning that shock over more in the chassis. The more you lean it over is going to allow for a little bit more wheel travel relative to piston speed and stroke of the shock. So that's one way to kind of mitigate the travel loss, but that mitigation of travel loss is still not as much as would be moving that shock up the arm and decreasing the motion ratio of the lower arm. So I just want to, hopefully you understand where I'm going with that, is that as you move the shock outboard, you're decreasing wheel travel, then you can simultaneously start leaning it in to gain some of that back. You won't gain all of it back, but you'll gain some of it back by leaning that shock in. And as that shock is leaned over more and more, the progressiveness of that shock's addition to the motion ratio calculation changes. So the more lean, the more progressive the motion ratio will change. But it's a subset of the overall motion ratio because that number on the lower arm is the primary for the motion ratio. And so with that said, the more you lean it over too, you can start to run into spring issues. You can start to run into some valving issues and things like that. And that's why you really don't see trucks past like what Gordon does. He is definitely the most extreme example as far as big truck stuff goes with the lean. Now, UTVs are totally different, and UTVs can get away with it for a few reasons. One, they don't weigh near as much. Two, they typically are not driven as hard for as long, to be perfectly fair. And three, they still do a decent job of getting wheel travel relative to shock stroke and an okay motion ratio, even though they lean over a fuckload. So again, these are the things that you're basically going to be fighting to factor a motion ratio into the equation for your suspension system. That is a combination of this number here first and the lean second. And so with that said, like here is a geyser. You can see their motion ratio on the lower arm. It's going to be in like the 60%, 65 percentile range would be my guess. Maybe a little bit of digression. We'll go into those in a little bit. The Mason trucks. So look at this. This is a good example of this one. Looks to be a hair. Watch. Let me see if I can open this. Open with paint. This fucking wizardry. Yeah, here we go. Now we're getting into my podcasting skill. Fucking subset is fucking improving. So yeah, so check this out. Here's a Mason truck. This is an older truck, to be fair, but still. Look at this. That right there. Pow. This ratio right here, I am willing to bet they are actually slightly inboard of, they're close to 90. Look at that. Not far off. Maybe a hair inboard. Maybe a hair inboard of 90. So they are right into that range of being like at that 90-degree rule, so to speak, on this specific Mason truck, and this is an older one. Here's I think this might be the same truck. This might be the same truck where you can see their lower arm motion ratio, etc. Another example of a two-wheel drive Mason. This is a newer one, but very similar motion ratio. So this is you can see the width of the shock pivots. So obviously their drivetrain is pushed a little bit further back to make sure they have clearance on the front drive assembly, etc. But you can see their shock pivots are very narrow, like literally like a fucking foot narrower than the Stewarts and the Weitzel that I was showing you. Here is a Mason all-wheel drive. You can see how wide their shock pivots are in the chassis, a little bit wider. Their motion ratio on the lowers are a little bit wider. I want to say these guys are roughly at 24 inches of wheel travel with their 14-inch stroke shocks, roughly. Another example of a Mason. This is a long travel arm. I'll get to that in a minute. Here's a Camber truck, one of the original Camber trucks. And I think they actually initially went with 16-inch stroke shocks, which is a little odd, but I think that's what they did initially. Not on this truck, maybe. Maybe this truck wasn't running. I think these are 14s. But they did do one with 16s. They had the shock really low in the arm, and they were trying to get like 28 inches of wheel travel, if I remember correctly. But these, I believe, are 14s, and they're like in the 25 inches of wheel travel range. Here's another good example. This is another Mason where their lower arm motion ratio is a lot closer to like where Robbie Gordon had it, and you can see the lean of that shock is definitely more on the progressive side of things. Yeah, here's, again, a little closer shot. So you can see they're down into, I would say, close to like the 75 percentile range on that lower arm motion ratio. This is a Class 10 setup I did. This is an Everson truck. And again, you can see he's like in the 65 percentile range. Probably pretty close to 90 degrees at compression would be my guess, given what seems to be a relatively narrow shock mounting point in the top of the chassis. Again, another shot of that Everson deal. You can kind of see their motion ratio. This is some of mine. And like I said, this is a T4 up here. So you can see I am definitely like 3 degrees digressive on this one because we do have that drivetrain package right there. Here's some others of mine where I have them leaned in a little bit more. Look at that. That one is really close to 90 and maybe a hair inboard of 90. And this is a stage 2 swing set steering setup. And there you go. There's a good example. You can see here's the center of the chassis. You can see how narrow I have these mounts in there. Get that motion ratio in a more favorable position, so to speak. But like I'm saying, if you have digression, do not sweat it. Again, here it is. So you can see how this works. This setup right here is a 14-inch stroke shock, 25 and change metal to metal, strapped at like 24 and change roughly, and a hair on the inside of that 90% deal. I'll dive into this. Those are inline shocks. Again, Weitzel, very digressive. Mega wide on the chassis side. Stewart's the same, wide on the chassis side, mega digression. This is the new G6 chassis from Geyser. And you can kind of see they are, I would say, 60% range, roughly, is a guess. And maybe 2 or 3 degrees digression at compression would be my guess. Somewhere in that range. So very similar to how my T4 is setup that I just pictured. This is a more complex long travel one I'll get into in a minute. This is a racer. This is a Racer Engineering. This is Luke McMillan's. Yeah. So you can see they do run it outboard. Same with like ES Motorsports and some of the older Porter stuff too. They run a motion ratio on the lower arm closer to like 70%, 75%. So they might be getting a little less wheel travel. So maybe they're in like the 24-inch wheel travel range, like metal to metal, and then strapped at like 23. That's not uncommon too, which is still plenty in these types of trucks. Here's that Stewart's I was referring to. Mega fucking digressive at compression. Mega digressive. And this is the complete inverse. Good old Gordon Huffman's truck. This is a Herbst truck. And as you can see, they are probably like 65% range. I'm guessing without measuring all of these, but they're in that range. So as you can see, there's a trend happening. You're like a hair above 50% to like 75, 80% max. Like that's the range that all these trucks are mounting this type of stuff at. So that is a good rundown on digressive, progressive shock packages, and just wanted to hammer home the fact that you don't need to stress yourself out if you end up with digression because of chassis constraints or an issue with getting stuff mounted properly. And on the progressive side of it, as you go more progressive, like you see with UTV stuff, which I'm not even going to bother pulling up. Everyone's fucking seen the UTVs. They lean over a fuckload. And so what happens is the more it leans over, the less efficient the shock starts to become. And so you have to account for that. You have to have a shock tuner that can account for that. And you also have to have appropriate amount of shock available. And and let's go over a few other facets too, because I want to talk about efficiency as well. So here we go. So as this ratio is higher, so like on what Gordon is doing, etc., and some of these other setups where they're at the 70 percentile range, the shock in essence is more efficient. So it's more efficient at controlling the movement of the wheel travel. As you increase the leverage on it and you run that motion ratio down closer to like the 50% range, the shock becomes less efficient of controlling the wheel travel. So there's this trade-off you have to basically decide on is, do I want to focus on the efficiency and wheel travel, or am I fighting the wheel travel, so to speak? So in other words, like on the Stewart's truck, the Weitzel trucks, they are definitely above 24 inches of usable wheel travel. And I think they're pushing like 26 and change on those. And so they are, in essence, sacrificing some of that shock efficiency for that extra wheel travel. Now on Gordon's situation, his is still pretty fucking efficient, even though he's got a decent lean at compression, because he has his so far outboard. And so that's somewhat of the battle, to put it very simply. Now, as you start to get really extreme with the lean, you're going to find that you'll battle, it could really start to bite you in the ass at compression, especially trying to control these heavier trucks. And that's why I also feel like you don't see that too much. And the reason Gordon can get away with that too is you have to understand his chassis dynamics are inherently significantly different than a front engine based truck. A mid engine based truck is totally different in those situations, and it acts more like a buggy to some degree. And so creating that variation of shock efficiency through travel by having it go significantly inboard is argument could be it's totally fine and acceptable for a truck like that. Now, the other side of the table too is like what ES was doing, and Racer and some of those others, where they might sacrifice a few inches of usable wheel travel compared to like a Stewart's or a Weitzel, but they have a little bit more efficient of a shock setup. I do like that as well. As you can see, some of like the stage 2 stuff I was showing, some of my other stuff, etc., I am favoring that 90-esque degree rule and maybe a hair inboard. But at the same time, I've also done stuff that's digressive that's totally fine too. And again, there's winning trucks with a bunch of digression as well built into the system. So that being said, if you're in these sort of ballparks and you have these sort of larger shock packages, a competent shock tuner is going to be able to get you going in the right direction. If you're outside of these ballparks, you got something super cattywampus, or you're running a really low percentage on the arm motion ratio with a really short stroke shock and undershocked. So in other words, like you're trying to pull 24 inches of wheel travel with a 12-inch stroke shock, and you're trying to like run a 3-inch bypass on a full-size pre-runner, you're going to completely cook that fucking shock. You're not in the ballpark to get that appropriately shocked, so to speak, to survive. Now, I don't claim to be a shock tuner, and I don't think that shock tuners can, for the most part, claim to understand the geometry side of the equation as well, because it's like two different sides. Like this is the mechanical geometry side, is the stuff I'm referring to. Shock tuning legitimately is more of an art form. And the reason I say that is there is no like fundamental mathematics that goes into shock tuning. Like there just fucking isn't. The best shock tuners that are in this industry legitimately have two things going for them. They can visually see the truck at speed and understand where they want to go next with the movement of the suspension. And two, which is even more important, is their ass dyno. They can get in the truck and feel the truck at speed and then understand where to go next. So the combination of those is far more of an art or an artistic aspect to it than it is like a mechanical engineering aspect. And with that said, that's why I was referring to earlier that competent shock tuners, they don't give a fuck about digression. They'll tune that truck to be fucking legit, and then the drivers are going to love them. Hence the Stewarts, hence the Weitzels, hence why these are such, sought after pre-runners, so to speak, et cetera, et cetera. And now for obvious reasons, there's builders that believe the inverse of that. And again, that's totally fine. Like obviously Gordon is on the whole other side of the spectrum than like Stewart's or Weitzel. And I understand the direction they're going in that. I'm just trying to give you guys an understanding of where the reality of the industry is when it comes to these specific characteristics. And then I tend to point closer to that 90-degree rule, hair inboard, but at the same time, I'm not afraid of a few degrees of digression either. Now, and then we'll review the rear suspension stuff when I get to that whole section. I'm still focused on the IFS stuff right now. That's why we're doing this. And I just wanted to go over that. Now let's dive. And then, like I'm saying on that, or with that said, if you can stuff a larger stroke shock into the assembly and get that lower arm motion ratio better, it's always a better equation. So if you're on the fence of like running a 12-inch or a 14-inch on your pre-runner and it's like a center mount deal, try and stuff a 14-inch. And typically the trucks, vehicles that are in the 89 or 88-inch track range plus, you're going to be running a 14-inch stroke shock. Stuff that's like 84, 85, 86, 87-inch track widths most likely will be like a 12-inch stroke shock. And what I'm referring to is side-by-side shocks versus inline. So let's review that too. We'll come to that in a minute. Let me cover a few more aspects so I don't get fucking too off base here. So progressive, digressive, we're still focusing on this, and let's review some long travel stuff with that too, because in the long travel stuff, it works in the same fashion. So like here's a lower arm I designed for Morgan Clark. It's an F-150 kit. You can see in this, we are in that 70 percentile, 65 percentile range, I'd say. 60, somewhere in that range. So obviously above 50%, and obviously not like 80%. I don't remember what this was specifically. I want to say it's a 12-inch stroke shock and 18 and change inches of wheel travel, or 19 inches of wheel travel. God, it's been a while. And I do so much stuff that I got to refer to my notes, but that's horrible. I should have this stuff memorized, but when you're drawing shit all day long every day, it gets annoying. Here's another long travel setup I did for Izzy Fabrication. This is a Silverado deal where you can see the coilover is closer to, this is an offset inline-esque shock setup, and we can review those here in a minute. But the point being is on this long travel stuff, there is the same sort of battle that you're going to end up playing with shock placement relative to the setup. Oh, this is that Morgan Clark arm we 3D printed. Oh, here's an interesting fact. So the last few years, whatever you want to call it, when we're doing stuff like this, where we're setting up new suspensions and packages, we do 3D print entire one-to-one assemblies of the arms and components for clients. So like, oh, sorry. There we go. I want you guys to see this. Totally butchered that. But podcasting failed just now. Let me fix this. Cool. So in this deal, this is a 3D printed arm that we done for Morgan, and it's allowing us to put it on the truck, cycle it, get everything dialed in, check the bypass tube clearance, check everything. We 3D printed the upper arm, the upright, and all of this. This is for an F-150, so that what he can do is get this put in place and basically make sure everything's kosher. So this is a new thing, relatively speaking, in industry, where we can print one-to-one components like this. Like this is a complete lower arm, and it's this arm right here that I designed for him, and it's at that like 65, like I was just saying, the 65% mark range for that shock, stroke, and motion ratio on the lower. And for obvious reasons, on long travel stuff, you're pretty much fucked on that 90-degree rule. You'd be surprised. A lot of them do end up running digression and stuff like that. So don't sweat it. Again, if you're mounting stuff in your long travel kit and you end up with some digression, I would not sweat that at all. That is something that could be totally considered normal, because you're dealing with a stock frame. You're dealing with a bunch of bullshit that is in the way, the drivetrain, etc., and these relatively short arms that you're trying to get a bunch of travel on. So you typically are going to have, you know, a 55% range, 50% range plus, the 65, 70% range, maybe on the high side. Like long travel stuff ends up being usually closer to like 55%, 60% on the norm, because you're trying to get like 18 inches of wheel travel out of a 10-inch stroke shock all the time. Or like 16 and change out of like a 10-inch stroke shock. These are 12-inch stroke shocks, and we're at like 18, 19 inches of wheel travel on this specific setup. So we're higher on that lower arm motion ratio to some degree. But you have to remember, on the long travel kits, because there's the stock frame and you're dealing with all the other bullshit, you don't have the opportunity to dive the shocks inboard and lean them on the inside or progressive side of that 90-degree rule near as much. And so with that said, that's why most of the long travel stuff does end up infringing on the digressive side. And that's where I just wanted to really hammer home that you guys shouldn't be stressed on that or worried too much, so to speak, because like it's really not much of a problem for these types of setups, because I don't want people like, you know, running their mouth or talking shit to their buddies and stuff like that because they have digression in their fucking long travel Toyota or whatever you want to call it, or Silverado. You know, it's totally going to be fine. I would not stress it one bit. Hold on, I got to take some vitamins. On a health schedule, trying to get back to as I was in my younger, more formidable competitive days. But so just wanted to really hammer home this progressive digressive bullshit, get that out of the way. Now let's talk about height in the arm and things like that. So mounting the shocks in the arm, so to speak, or above the arm, or relationship to the center point of the arm, like in this diagram, like you can see the center point, so to speak, would be straight across, and this is a hair above that. And I'll show you some other examples. I do it in several different ways, so there is no like consensus, so to speak, because it usually has to deal with packaging constraints, style and design of the arm, and things like that. Let's see if this is the one I want. Here we go. Perfect. So here is a compiling of multiple different setups. So let's see if I can work my magic on this. Paint. There we go. Pow. So let's draw some lines in here so you guys can see what I'm referring to. So we're going to take what is roughly the center point of the chassis side, go to that center point of the bearing. Pow. You can see that guy. Let's do this one. We'll do this one. Not exact science, but you start to understand what's going on. So it is kind of an optical illusion to some because of how the arms are set up and designed. Cool. So typically speaking, the reason shocks are mounted in one way, shape, or form has to do with how you're designing the lower arms or packaging constraints. When you're doing tube chassis stuff or big trucks stuff, etc., usually you have plenty of room to mount the shocks on top of the arm without an issue. Like, and I'll show you some examples. We'll go through those examples here in a minute, but let's focus on these here. So this second one down, this is a stage 1 bulkhead setup. This is done in a very simple plasma table friendly arm construction that's basically an Oreo, and we're going to go through more details on fabrication. But as you can see here, the shock mount is above the arm, and basically what we do in these is we have a straight line from the top of this pivot to the large 1.5-inch bearing, and this is a flat plate straight across. This shock, this 4.5-inch bypass end, so to speak, we make sure he has about 200 thousandths of clearance to that plate. So an 1/8 inch 200 thousandths is totally fine for the rod end on the shock. in relationship to the plate that's the top of the arm, and then we would make the tabs appropriate for that. So for obvious reasons, he sits pretty high above center line. And that's totally fine. I will show you some examples of trucks that are like that, and then others that are not like that. But the point being is, it obviously makes the chassis side shock pivot higher. And now on these tube chassis trucks or full-size trucks, if you're running a 14-inch stroke shock and you have appropriate amount of compression, travel, etc., typically you're still not going to have that shock through the hood of the truck, even when it's mounted in this fashion. So you can get away with it for the most part in a setup like this. Now that one on the top is one of our stage 2 arms, where I actually dive the arm down, but I still keep the mount above the arm for simplicity's sake, and it makes the construction of the arm a little easier because the shock's not mounted in the arm, creating like a pocket, so to speak. And it also, I do like it for prep reasons too. So there is a caveat to having a non-pocketed arm for prep reasons, that you can have that, so to speak, above the arm where the bolt is easily accessible and things like that. And then the downside to something like that would be the arm is obviously, there's a good space below it, below center line. So like ground clearance would be the other argument in that specific example. And some of these bigger trucks, for the most part, as long as you're kind of in that range, it's totally fine. It's not too much of a hindrance to some degree. Now, if you start getting too excessive on the downside, it could be bad. But like this would be as low as I would ever go, so to speak. Going down, so here's a T4 trophy truck arm. Again, the shock is basically on center point. And we do have a little bit it further down than, say, like this flat arm. And, yeah, a little bit of a ground clearance dealio there. Here's another trophy truck arm for a client that I did. The shock is mounted in the arm, so it's really far below center point, about 1.5 inches below center line. And the arm does dig down. Now, in this specific situation, the chassis this is going on had a relatively low mid-rail. And so they were trying to keep everything below that. So we had to mitigate that by dropping it. So if you were to take this right here, which is 1.5 inches below, and this guy, which is 1.5 inches above, I mean, I just gained like 3 inches of shock height at compression in the chassis if you were to compare those two arms, so to speak. Here's another arm where the shock is a hair above that midline. And again, it's a little bit below, but it's not terribly below. So there is a little bit of, ground clearance fuckery, so to speak, as opposed to a flat arm. But again, these are not really that extreme. And we can look at some examples, but this is all a very good range of what I would say is normal shock mount locations throughout the industry without having issues or hindrance in other situations. But this is all pertaining to tube chassis-based stuff and full-size tube chassis-based stuff. So obviously some of the mid-size based tube chassis stuff where you have a lower mid-rail, an arm like this one right here, the second one down, may not be preferred, or it might cause too high of a mount in the chassis. Rarely do you see that, but again, it's definitely plausible. Definitely plausible. Because I mean, a 14-inch stroke shock compressed is still 25 and change inches overall length. And so that's a good distance, that you got to fit into that chassis. And then if you start dragging it way fucking down below center line, like, again, you're just running more of a risk of issues with ground clearance and running and hitting stuff. And so you just got to keep that in mind. The dirt is not forgiving and rocks are not forgiving. So if you start running into it too low below center line, you're running the risk of fucking stuff up more, so to speak. So again, you just got to keep that stuff in mind as well. And simplicity of how you want to design the arms. Like these arms, like these two top arms are very simple to build. These two in the middle here are a little more complex because they're more pocketed arms. And then this one on the bottom, again, is a very simple arm to build with the tabs just straight on top. So you got to factor that into the equation too. How difficult or simple do you want the arms to build? So let's look at some of those examples. Let's start back at the front. Like here's Gordon's. His is above the arm, so to speak, and a very straight, simple arm. I mean, this is back in the days when they would cut the stuff by hand per se. But again, there's one example of it just being straight up on top of the arm. No fucks given on that. Yeah, there you go. Perfect example. It's a flat arm with a little kick into it, and this guy is definitely above center point between this bearing and the chassis. Geyser is kind of in the arm and almost on center point. They're damn close to that center point, and they are like a pocketed arm. I'll get into that. I mean, this one's above-ish the arm. This is, but Mason is above the arm, so there's our above center point. You can also see it kind of how high in the chassis those mounts are. Same with that. Again, somewhat above the arm center point, even though this arm does kick down. On the all-wheel drive, they're still above the center point. This is that arm I did for Morgan. Here's another example. This is a Camber arm where they really do swoop this down a decent amount, and this pivot does look like it may be below center point slightly, actually, even with the big swoop. So they're really pushing the limit of this being this relatively low in the chassis. Another Mason where they are above center point. This is a class 10 one I did where it is above center point in this arm. An Everson one where they are above center point of the arm slightly. Again, above center point. This is a T4 arm I just showed you. Here's some of the arms I just showed you that I designed. This one is in the arm. This is an old Jimco. And I'll get into the shock deal with this. It's called Inline Shocks. So here's the Weitzel again. He is above the arm, pretty high above the arm. And coincidentally, look at how high the shock mount is in the chassis. I mean, he's above, he's right fucking there. So this is about as, again, like I'm saying, you can fit that in these big trucks. It's totally possible. But that would be on the extreme side, definitely. As far as that goes, bump stop, shock mounts. Let's see some of the other examples. And I'll get into more of the shock mount stuff. I just wanted to show like the lower arm height relation based stuff. Now, the mount on the arm too is only one factor. The amount of lean at compression also drastically decreases the height in the chassis as well. So again, Geyser looks like they are right below center line with this arm. These new G6 arms. This is an offset one. I have one that the coilover is roughly at center line. The bypass is not, and I'll explain this in a few. This is a Racer Engineering one. He looks like he is right above center line on those arms. This is that Morgan Clark arm I was talking about. He is a hair below center line on this arm. The Stewarts are basically at center line, roughly, and they're pocketed arms. Yeah, you can see that. They're maybe a hair below center line or right at center line. Now, Gordon's is above center line by a good chunk, but he also leans his in a bunch, and I'm pretty sure this is more than a 14-inch stroke shock. This might be like a 16-inch stroke shock. I just don't remember. It's been so long since I saw the stuff on this specific truck, the Huffman truck. These are 14-inch stroke shocks on this Herbst truck. Again, they're roughly a hair above center line. This is the Lugo truck that was done by Mark Newham. Yeah. And again, a hair above center line for the coilover. Bypass a little different. This is an offset deal that I'll get into in a second. But yeah, so just wanted to review some of the normal stuff you see with this. Now, in the long travel side of the table, there's a lot of long travel kits that make the arms very simple and the shocks just mount on top. That's very common. And typically speaking with long travel trucks, it's almost easier to some degree. So most of the long travel kits are running like 10-inch stroke shocks. 10-inch stroke shock is not very tall. It's significantly shorter than the 14-inch stroke shock for obvious reasons. So on a full-size long travel truck, a 10-inch stroke shock is nowhere near the fucking hood line. It just simply isn't, even if you mount the shock on top of the arm. Now, a 12-inch stroke shock on top of the arm still is not going to be the hood line. What you usually run into in the long travel applications, especially on the driver's side, is the factory braking system is usually the problem. And that combined with the wheel travel limitation is usually why you see 10-inch stroke shocks, maybe a 12-inch stroke shock on long travel stuff. And so with that said, if you're mounting the arm if you're mounting the shocks in the arm on like a Silverado, like Missoula did many years ago, and a bunch of other companies have done as well for long travel stuff, you're obviously decreasing the height in the chassis of that shock tower as well on like the Silverados, etc. So again, some mitigation of that, but the argument could be made you don't necessarily need to do that. The vast majority of long travel kits, from like Kibtech to fucking Blitzkrieg to Camber, they are just mounting them on top of the arms. And then some of the Raptor stuff, it's mounted in the arm, etc. But like I'm saying, most of the long travel based stuff for trucks, they're not running 14-inch stroke shocks. So even at full compression, the collapsed length of the shocks are nowhere near the top of the hood. So they're more than fine on that aspect. So, but yeah, I just wanted to get you guys some insight into height of the arm, and just to review again, totally fine to mount on top of the arm. There's nothing wrong with that. Now, you don't want to go too high on this, because you don't want this sort of triangle that's created here to get too tall, like I'm putting here in the green. As that triangle starts to get taller and taller, so to speak, what ends up happening is the width in the chassis of that shock mount starts to move too rapid. So like on the digressive side, it could accidentally kick you into being significantly more digressive than you want at compression, like really quickly, because as that arm moves upward, this pivot, because he's so high off the arm, starts to really move inboard. So like I'm saying, when you do mount him on top of the arm, you want to mount that shock, the pivot of the shock, like as close as you can. So the rod in itself, give it like an 1/8 inch, maybe 200 thousandths off the top plate of the arm, and that's where you want that tab to be. You don't want to be touching the arm, obviously, and you don't want to be like a fucking inch off the arm. You want to get that as low as you can. And then for the inverse side of the equation, if you're diving the arm downward, you just have to remember you want to do the best you can to mitigate damage from rocks and stuff. So don't just willy-nilly make the arm a huge fucking V. That is definitely not considered ideal by any means. So again, you're seeing this sort of variation, and the variation is almost like 3 inches of difference. Like this is maybe like 4 inches of difference, because this may be like 2 inches above that line, so to speak, and this one's like 1.5 inches below. So like 3.5 inches of difference is like sort of like a variation that I have personally drawn myself in different setups. So yeah, so now let's go through the 2 variations, or 3 variations, so to speak, of mounting shocks in the arms, side by side and inline. So side by side, I'm not referring to UTV shit, just so we're clear. We're talking about the style of the arm. This would be considered side by side mounting of the shocks. They are equal length in stroke, the coilover and the bypass, and they are mounted parallel to each other on that lower arm. Pretty much everything here other than UTV shit is going to be mounted on the lower arm. So UTV stuff's a whole different fucking ballgame. And this is considered side-by-side mounting. This is by far the most common. This is what I prefer. I have done inline stuff, and let me show you what inline is. So here is inline shock mounting. The coilover is inboard of the bypass, and typically they are in line of each other, and there's also offset in line, and I'll show you that in a second. But this is, to be crystal clear, this is just not ideal, and you definitely want to avoid this if you can, and there's a few reasons for that. One, it causes, well, let me rephrase that. For some buggies, this does work out just fine, and you can fit larger stroke bypass shocks towards the outboard, lean them over a fuck ton. And so like for some of the buggy stuff, you'll be able to get like a 12-inch stroke coilover in there and a 14-inch stroke bypass, and you'll still be at 22, 23 maybe inches of wheel travel, like in a class 1 car, or maybe like a 10 car, like 21 inches of wheel travel. And you have this sort of shock package that the coilover sits just inboard. The reason I'm not a fan of these is because the coilover ends up having to be so low on that lower arm motion ratio that it gets difficult to spring the car sometimes, and you end up having to sacrifice some weird performance dynamics by having fucking high as shit springs to get the car to sit right and feel right, so to speak. And they can be hard to tune because of that. The other thing too is the the coilover and bypass diameter wise tends to fight you pretty big. Like you can't really do like a fucking 4.5 inch bypass and a 3.0 coilover in these situations really well. They're too big and close so that when they cycle they want to fucking hit. So typically you end up having to run smaller shock packages in this stuff. Hence why, like I was saying, like in the buggy situations, you can get away running inline stuff a little bit more. And even with that said, like this is a class 10 buggy deal we did. Now the same fucking track width, wheelbase, suspension dynamics, here's the class 10 side-by-side variant. And I would definitely push customers to run this. Instead, I feel like this is a much better option and route, so to speak, than the inline one. You can run much larger shock package and a much larger bypass. They're not going to hit each other. I feel like it's easier to tune because they're fucking the same stroke, so they have the same motion ratio and all that goodness. So again, just one of my preferences. But if you start looking at all the trucks, etc., you're going to start to see that too. Like fucking side by side. Those are all side by side. This is fucking inline. This is an older Jimco. And again, even Jimco has gone away from this. Like they're not doing this anymore. They did this on this one truck, and I think it was relatively low. I think it's the Mango truck. Someone could correct me. Dave Tungan could probably correct me if he ever watches this, because he knows those guys. And like I was saying, I'm not the biggest fan of this for a few reasons. On a truck like this, a front engine truck, holy fuck, I feel so bad for the shock tuner, and the fucking spring setup on this has just got to be fucking hating life. That poor coilover. But like I said, this is very uncommon, and I don't think Jimco is doing this ever again, to be perfectly fair. You can start to see how this front end is set up in this specific race truck. And this is an older truck. Side by side for the Weitzel. This and that. Now, I'll get into that one in a second. Let's go. There's Gordon. Gordon is, okay, so this is an internal bypass coilover. This is where you start to see single shock per corner, and the fuckery that he has is totally different than what a lot of guys are running and a lot of guys have run in the past. So it's not the best comparison because Gordon does think different. He does do shocks differently. With that said, he doesn't have a bypass on this specific truck. And I think this is Huffman's and back then. And obviously things have changed and things like that. And I believe he has driven trucks that do have coilover bypass. He has driven geyser trucks and things like that. But the point being here is this is a single shock, so it's technically not inline or side-by-side. And that's what we're focusing on right now. So Stewart's is side-by-side. Now let's get into what's considered like offset stuff. And one of the most recent examples is this one. And I'll get into the reason why for that. But let me go through what I did for Izzy Fabrication. So here's Izzy's, what we call an offset inline shock setup. The shocks are truly not side-by-side, and they're truly not inline. Now, when Izzy wanted me to do this, what we wanted to do was maximize the shock efficiency and robustness, so to speak, to the wheel travel. And with doing so, what we have here is a 10-inch coilover and a 12-inch bypass. Now, if you look from this angle, clearly the bypass is mounted down here. So he's below center line and further outboard, and the coilover is closer to center line but far more inboard. But as you can see, they're slightly offset from each other in the chassis. So they're not in line, so to speak, like this, and they're not side by side. They're like this. They're offset in line. And what I have done here is I have made it to where the stroke of the coilover complements the stroke of the bypass, so that we're using all of the stroke of that 10-inch coilover and all of the stroke of the 12-inch bypass to get us, and I want to say this was 18 and change inches of wheel travel. This is a GMT 900 race kit. And so what this means is now he can run a 3.0 coilover and a 4.5-inch bypass, big boy shit, on the front of a Silverado, and we're maximizing the efficiency and usage of those shocks as best we can so that nothing is wasted. Because these trucks do get really fucking heavy, and that's what we're battling in this scenario. So this would be an inline offset shock setup in a long travel application. And this I did specifically at request for Izzy. Now let's look at this in a trophy truck application. This is Wayne Lugo's new truck by the infamous Mark Newham. He does the same thing or very similar to what I'm referring to, where what I think, and I don't know for sure, is I think he may have run a 16-inch bypass and a 14-inch coilover. May have. I don't know. I would have to message him. But the point being is he's offset these shock mounts in a fashion that in theory would be doing the same thing like I did on Izzy's setup. I don't know the specifics. Obviously, I didn't design this. This was done by Mark, and maybe even done by him, knowing him. And I just want to give you an example of what would be considered an offset inline setup. And so those are the primary issues with why inline basically blows. And side-by-side is definitely the norm. So all competitive trucks these days are running side-by-side stuff. Realistically speaking, like we can start going through them, side-by-side, inline. That was the Jimco. Everson side-by-side, Everson side-by-side, side-by-side, Mason side-by-side, Camber side-by-side, Mason side-by-side, all-wheel drive Mason side-by-side, stuff like that. So this is inline. Again, that was for buggy. Geyser side-by-side. This is a single shock Chet Huffman. This is that Robbie Gordon deal. So neither inline or side-by-side. Internal bypass fuckery. That's what this is. And then obviously all of the UTV stuff there's single shocks. We're not allowed to put coilover bypass on the UTVs. Which just reminds me, let me see if I can pull something up from that I designed like almost 12, 14 years ago. Oh, a long time ago now. Holy fuck. While I'm scrolling. So yeah, the UTV classes are requiring you to stick to like the single coilover per side, so to speak. So with that said, we can't really deviate from that. We can't just start adding bypasses and things like that. So in UTV racing, what in essence we're doing to get stuff better is we're converting cars over that are not initially, or whatever you want to call it, into 3-inch internal bypass shocks. And they are still a coilover, but instead of like a factory 2.5-inch shock, etc., they are coming with a 3-inch internal bypass like the Kings, etc. Now check this shit out. This I did a long time ago. This is an entire bulkhead designed that bolts into a fucking Polaris 1000. Yeah, throwback roughly 10 years ago. And this was posted over a year ago. And so this, I redesigned the whole bulkhead with the components, J-arm front end, etc. And I ran a coilover bypass in this scenario. And so this is not race legal, even though this is technically a UTV. And we did the same for the rear coilover bypass. I did this for the guys at Sandcraft. And I had a much nicer shock geometry on that shit and everything. And the four-wheel drive system, all-wheel drive system was working. But this would be considered not race legal and not really normal for UTV stuff. I mean, this is an entirely basically new fucking bulkhead chassis. Like, none of these pivots are stock. I redid all of it. And it cycled 22 inches of travel on these setups. And so that would be unusual for UTV. The vast majority of UTV stuff is like the all-sub cars I designed. These are running, internal bypass, coilovers, single per side. These cars are really, they look robust as fuck, but you'd be surprised how lightweight they are. These chassis are under, I don't want to disclose what it is. I can tell you the chassis are under 400 pounds. That's all that I want to disclose in that. But because UTV racing is very competitive, and we have designed a bunch of UTV race cars. Like here's one. These are all internal bypass single coilovers on each corner, and we don't really change. Well, the shock geometries are slightly modified in these cars, so to speak, but they are inherently relatively close to stock. We are not changing them a fuckload like we do in other applications. Like here's an all-wheel drive one car that we did for towers. You can see the shock tower here, and they're moderately narrow in the chassis for those mounts. But yeah, so that's some of the stuff that has to do with the UTV bits. Beam stuff, I feel like I'm going to have to do more stuff on beams. Beams are their own fucking wild animal, and we'll get into that. So yeah, here's one of the Allsup cars. You can see the shocks are relatively inboard. I mean, if you look at a stock Can-Am, it's similar. These are not stock. I do move them around in very specific ways, and do make adjustments that we have found make these cars work a lot better and faster. And that stuff I'm not going to fucking disclose on a podcast for obvious reasons, because I get paid to make sure guys like Allsup continue to win races to some degree. So with that said, the point being is we do not have the luxury of running coilover bypass on this bullshit. So it is what it is when it comes to the UTV bits. Get rid of the Justin thing. We already admonished him pretty good. But yeah, so that would be inline versus side-by-side, and then offset inline as well. So Armada runs inline. Vildosula runs inline. I've seen that stuff too. Again, it's not my style. Different strokes, different folks. I just have found that to be not as rad, and typically more frustrating for guys setting stuff up. So now let's dive into some bump stop stuff. And again, this is another section that I feel like some people don't understand, overlook, etc. Oh, I just saw my wife through the window. We have a window in the podcast studio, and she's out there. I don't know what she's doing. Wonder where the fucking kids are. But let's go through some bump stop stuff. So I'm focused primarily on the IFS stuff. So obviously, I'm only going to be reviewing stuff that has to pertain to the front. Rear stuff is different yet similar. So first and foremost, this is what a bump stop looks like in a can. This is a traditional bump stop, like a King or a Fox. On the front of these trucks, for the most part, we're running a 2-inch stroke by 2.5-inch or a 2-inch diameter bump stop. And what the bump stop does, a hydraulic bump stop, is your very final stage of oh fuck. So when the suspension compresses, wondering if I have. When the suspension is at full compression, your bump stop would be engaging that last stage, so to speak. And that is what's going to prevent the shock from grenading in on itself, from collapsing on itself when it shouldn't be. You shouldn't really be relying on the bypass or the shocks to be the final stop in the chassis. Now, with that said, these are hydraulic bump stops. You can have these or you can have hard stops. So, here, oh, perfect. Here's a hard stop on one of the Camber trucks. And some guys do prefer this. And the concept here really boils down to, you want the bypass to basically be controlling as much as the wheel travel as possible, including the final bump zone. And you can have a bypass tube layout that complements a final, like, 2-stage bump zone, so to speak, where those last 8 inches, 6 inches, 4 inches, 3 inches of wheel travel is heavily controlled by the top of like a 4.5-inch bumps, 4.5-inch diameter bypass shock. And properly tuned, you'd be surprised how some trucks don't really need bump stops. So there is definitely an argument that can be made that in some applications you do not need a hydraulic bump stop. You need a final stop, which is what this is. It's a polyurethane bump stop on a metal tab that upper arm is going to either hit that polyurethane, or let's pretend that polyurethane gets torn the fuck off. It's going to hit metal to metal, and at a minimum, it's going to save the bypass from collapsing in on itself. So it's a final stop. Again, there's another perfect picture. And like the way Camber did it in this setup is definitely proper. I do like how they did that. And here's another one. This is a oh, fuck. What truck is this? I think this is a Stewart's truck. Yeah, I think this is a Stewart's truck with a final polyurethane bump pad in the chassis. So they're controlling it with the bypass for the most part. So in other words, the bypass is taking up as much of the suspension travel control, because once you engage that hydraulic bump stop in the suspension travel, it kind of deteriorates the bypass's ability to continue controlling it effectively, because that bump stop is like a really fucking hard impact, so to speak, in the suspension travel. So you're not necessarily tuning that. So with that said, let's review on the proper aspects of getting these mounted and set up in a chassis. First and foremost, when I'm designing them in the computer, I'm obviously getting, either the file from the manufacturer like King, or I am drawing it myself. So this is just a basic can with a King 2.5 inch by 2 inch stroke bump stop in the can. If you notice, I have removed the Delrin from the model and I have fully collapsed this. This is what you need to do either in real life or in the computer when mounting bump stops. Do not fucking mount bump stops with the Delrin on it. Do not fucking mount bump stops without them fully compressed. Those are huge no-nos, and we're going to dive into that right now. So, in the computer or in real, let's go over what I do in the computer first and foremost. So this is how I would set up a bump stop like on a long travel kit. If you notice, I have the Delrin removed. It's at full compression. I actually dive it in about 3/8 of an inch into the metal. And I do that when the shock is at full collapse. So this is a bypass at full collapse. So with the shock at full collapse in the computer, I will dive that bump stop into that plate work, like 400 thousandths, 3/8 of an inch. Let me show you another example. So this is what it looks like with the Delrin. So obviously the Delrin is in this CAD model, but there you go. There's another example. I'm diving that 3/8 of an inch into that little bump stop pad on top of this arm. And so what you can do with that is basically you're ensuring that at catastrophic failure, you're never going to have the bypass fully, compress on itself. That at all times, I am making sure that bypass will be safe, so to speak. And so I'm creating a tiny little bit of buffer zone, 3/8 of wheel travel, because you have to assume the Delrin's going to get fucking torn off and destroyed, really soon in the race. Here's another example. I dive it into the fucking arm, that 3/8 of an inch, to, do that. But just so we're clear, when I'm doing that, the shock in the computer is like this. The shock is fully compressed. So that's one way to do it. Now, if you're doing this in real life, or another way to do it in the computer, because obviously in real life, you can't dive the bump stop into the material. You just can't do that. But in the computer, I can. But in real life, you can't do that. So in real life, you have to give the shock some showing of shock shaft. I like to go about 150 thousandths to 200 thousandths range. So get like a shim in there that like a 3/16 shim. There's a good number right there. Throw it into that so that the shock looks like this. Then you can mount your bump stop like this, where you have the Delrin removed and you just have it metal to metal compressed. So now what's happening is I have the shock set with 3/16 range of open, so to speak, or extension. Now I can just set my bump stop metal to metal, set it on there. Because obviously in real life, you can't dig it into the material like this. You just set it on like that with that little shim in the shock. And that way you are at a minimum making sure you're not going to grenade the bypass. Because even if shit hits the fan and you fucking completely eliminate the Delrin and this thing is fully fucking compressed, which on a bus is really hard to do, you're still going to save that bypass. And that's the key. And this is the proper way to do bump stop mounting. So many fucking dudes do not follow this, or they mount it with the fucking Delrin, or they don't do this effect and they just assume that it's fine. And it's not. Like you're gonna fuck stuff up. So you gotta always take into consideration there's gonna have flex in the arms, movement in the chassis, stuff like that. So you have to create these buffer zones. And this is the way to do it. Either in the computer, you dive you make the shock fully collapsed and dive the bump stop into the fucking arm in CAD, or you put a 3/16 shim or show, shock shaft showing, and then make it metal to metal on your bump stop. That's the proper way to do this. So don't get fucking lazy. Do this shit properly. And angle. Angle of the fucking dangle on these guys. Okay, so here's a good example. When you mount the bump stop, either real life, etc., you want it at 90 degrees. You do not want it digressive at all. You want it at 90 degrees to the mount, just so we're clear. In this picture, you can see the arm is angled more than the mount. The mount I have offset upwards, so to speak, to match. And the reason for that, oh, here's a good example. This is one of Izzy's arms. You want that bump stop 90 degrees to the mount because the bump is going to hit further inboard and slide. These bumps will. Now, slapper arms won't, and I'll get to that in a second. But these are going to contact the arm, lower in the travel, and then the bump is going to hit, and it's going to slide up the mount, so to speak. So when you do a mount like this at full compression, you want to favor the bump towards the outside of the plate. So in other words, I have some interior of the plate here because the bump will slide, like in Izzy's case, this bump slid about 400 thousandths across this mount as it contacts and goes through travel because there's a lot of camber change in this system. So at full compression, I have the bump stop obviously leaning towards the outboard, which is fine because it's going to contact the pad closer to this side of the mount and then slide outboard ever so slightly. So some setups will have the contact and slide close to 200 thousandths, 250 thousandths. Some are a little bit more, like in the long travel stuff, because of the severe camber change and the upper arms usually get kicked a lot more, there ends up being a little bit more sliding effect on the bump stop on the arm. And so to mitigate that, you have to keep in mind you want it at 90 degrees. You do not want it digressive. Digressive is going to make that sliding worse, and it's going to put it in the opposite direction, which could end up stressing the bump stop internals more. And you don't want it too progressive either. You want it to be perfectly at 90. That's best. If anything, like 89 degrees, so a hair inboard. Those are like the range. You don't want to do like what the shocks do and lean them way the fuck in or let it go digressive. So the 90-degree rule for the bump stop itself definitely fucking holds. And again, on the mount itself, you want the mount to have material inboard of it, a decent amount, like a 1/4 inch to 400 thousandths extra inboard when it's at full compression, because it's going to contact further inboard and slide up to that number, so to speak, or slide into position. So that's why it looks like, oh, I fucked up. The bump stop's offset. No, it's not. The bump stop actually contacts at a perfect spot and slides into this position. So the majority of the stroke of the actual bump stop, or the sliding stroke of the bump stop contacting that pad, is actually in the middle of that pad. So that would be considered proper in this scenario. Again, something that's obviously overlooked. Again, here's another perfect example. This is a Herps truck. You can see this is set at an angle to match this bump stop at compression. And here's another way of doing it too. They don't even run the Delrin. They're just running possibly just a brass end here, and he's contacting this metal piece, and you can see how it slides on this slider right here. This is a great way of doing it. The only thing that sucks with this is it's obviously more expensive to do this. On race trucks like these, totally acceptable, you know? And they've gone away from this too. Last one I saw is they're doing these aluminum uppers with the bumps mounting in the upper arm, so they're getting the height of the bump stop lower in the chassis too. But again, this is not necessarily a bad way of doing it. And it's unfortunately a little bit more expensive, so most guys are not going to be doing it in that realm. Here's a mount on a T4 chassis that I did. Final mount. Here's a Weitzel truck. You can see the bump stop is contacting the arm here. More final mounts. It's a long travel one. I'll get into that in a second. A Tisco truck. You can see the pad here. The angle of this pad does not match the arm, like I was saying. The pad itself is going to match this guy at that compression length. And so there's going to be scrubbing that happens. And that's what you're seeing here, the Delrin scrubbing on that pad as it cycles. Again, same thing here. But yeah, and then the other thing too is on long travel stuff, fuck, I forgot to pull the pictures. We can go look at them. On the long travel kits, there's two ways to mount these. Hold on, I'm just making sure I'm still going. Oh yeah, I'm still fine on my outline. There's two ways to mount these. either off the lower arm, which fucking blows, to be perfectly honest. This is not a good way of doing it. I really dislike doing it this way. And it fucks performance. It really does. And the reason for that is the bump stop is taking up way too much travel of the suspension when you're mounting like this. And this is not... I don't want to shit on people, but this is definitely done incorrectly. The Brenthal brothers, not ideal in this scenario. And for two reasons. One, I don't like mounting off the lower arm in general. These bump stops end up contacting the lower arm in a cycle of travel that borderline like fucking erases the whole fucking majority compression side of your bypass tuning. You know, it's basically fucking useless once you're into that bump stop. And two, like even when you're mounting it off the lower arm, you want it as far outboard as you can. Now, obviously, you can't go too crazy because you're probably going to have some weird fucking mount. It's going to fucking tear off the frame. So you got to keep that in mind. You can go a few inches off the frame, etc. But the key here is when you're doing this, at a minimum, you want to choke that bump stop up to realistically only being like 1 inch of travel. They did not in this picture. So like the cheat way to do this is you choke the bump stop up with an internal spacer so it's only stroking 1 inch, and then you crank that fucking PSI. So if the truck does happen to hit that in the far side of compression travel, hopefully, you can still use a lot of your bypass for tuning, and so you're not ruining your tuning mechanism, so to speak. And at the same time, it'll save the bypass to some degree. But yeah, I just wanted to show you that. Not a fan. I think that is incorrect. And the proper way to do it like off the upper arm, like I did actually in like I did here for the stuff for Izzy. This is off the upper arm above the upright above the upright on a long travel setup. This is contacting, in essence, 1-to-1. I mean, we're really maximizing that 2-inch stroke of the bump for the last 2 inches of wheel travel in a fashion that is, in essence, the best it can be. You know, the bump is going to survive. It's going to be utilized best. It's going to ride the best quality. It's going to control the travel the best. You're still using the majority of travel for the bypass, for the tuning, and all the other fun stuff. So, like, you're not fucking yourself over on the other aspects. So, like, this is pretty fucking proper, is the bottom line. Mounting off the lower arm, again, it can be done. The ways you want to mitigate that is maximize the stroke to 1 inch, crank that fucker up, and make sure that you have him really in that as far on the top side of compression travel as possible to leave as much of the bypass without having to engage the bump stop. Is really how it's proper. So on long travel stuff, again, upper arm and upright, if you can do that. Packaging constraint issues is typically why it doesn't happen. It's more difficult to get packaging all bitchin' in long travel stuff, and I get that. So that is the reason why guys will go the less install-inducive route and mount it in that fashion of on the arm, like I just showed you with the Brenthal stuff, which, whatever, different strokes for different folks, no pun intended. I'm not a big fan of that. You definitely want to avoid this at all costs if you're doing it. You know, run it off the top of the shock tower, get some tubes in there and a cross brace at a minimum, and you'll be much happier. I mean, this poor truck's just got to fucking work like shit, realistically speaking, because that bump stop, that much stroke of bump is basically deteriorating, you know, a good chunk of your compression tunability, which is the important stuff, in my opinion. But hey, different strokes for different folks, huh? So yeah, so that's the bump stop fuckery. Let's go into Ross King. Yeah, chassis mounts, shocks and bumps, bolt-in shock cross members versus non-bolt-in, and then we're gonna go into slap arms, which is another favorite of mine. So let's see. I have shock mounts open. Close that. We can close that. We'll close this. Shock mounts. Cool. Okay, so shock mounts in the chassis. There's kind of two basic styles here. There are shock mounts that bolt in, and then there are shock mounts that are welded into the chassis. Fundamentally speaking, these days, there's a differentiation between the two in that most race trucks these days are designed with shock mounts that are in the chassis and not bolt in. And I prefer that for a few reasons. One, it lets you build, like here's a Missoula one. The shock mounts are in the chassis. You can end up building a little bit of a lighter chassis and a less complex chassis in regard to prep. So for obvious reasons, the shock mounts are here, and here's our motor. And this is pretty tight on that fucking motor too. They're really pushing the limit on that bad boy. But you can have a mount assembly that is connected to the tube work, so to speak, and in the chassis. And that, again, like here's a Mason one. This is all part of the chassis. This is a really strong structure. This is an older trophy truck, I believe. Again, in the chassis, but this is rear engine, so it's kind of irrelevant to what I'm saying. But bolt-in. This is an older truck, bolt-in. Now, the bolt-in shock cross members, again, Cambergs, although they do have a bolt-in cross member, these shock pivots are welded into the chassis. So like I'm saying, you can have a lighter setup in general, a lighter chassis in general, by having the shock mounts integrated into the chassis. But for like luxury pre-runner stuff, I prefer to have bolt-in shock mounts because of the windshield and stuff. Being able to remove that whole tower makes prep a lot easier and drivetrain removal easier. So on the luxury pre-runner stuff, I actually prefer bolt-in shock tower stuff than on the trophy truck stuff. Here's an ID Designs race truck. These are in the chassis, obviously. This is a bolt-in one shock tower, shock brace thing that I did. This is a Ross King's luxury pre-runner. It's a Blazer. You can see the assembly bolts in, and here's the shock mounts. Similar format to what you've seen from like Nate at Blitzkrieg. Like this truck right here, this is a bolt-in one. He does a Sick Boy machined one though. So this whole shock cross member bolts in and out. And again, it's more uncommon that that's on race trucks these days, this whole section right here, because typically speaking, we can build the shock mounts into the chassis, and they are a lot lighter and more efficient. Like here's my T4 trophy truck design. It's built into the chassis, and so it makes for a much lighter. These chassis are under 800 pounds, so it's pretty fucking rad in that aspect that you can minimize that. Now, with that said, like here is a stage 1 bolt-in shock cross member for a luxury pre-runner. And I do prefer these. This was in a Silverado in the luxury pre-runner setting because you can remove all this shit, and now you have a lot more access to your drivetrain, because in the luxury pre-runners, we have a windshield and shit that's coming right here. So unlike the race trucks, we have the body and the windshield assembly that we have to fucking fight with on like a luxury pre-runner. And that's why I prefer bolt-in stuff on luxury pre-runners versus welded. Here's the Herps ones. These are welded in, as you can see. And, they don't have a windshield or all this stuff. Because like on a luxury pre-runner, your windshield's like here. So it's totally different scenario in regard to drivetrain prep and things like that. Again, here's a Tisco. They're welded in. And so here's, bolt-in one. This is a Silverado luxury pre-runner chassis that I designed. And the windshield's up here. So being able to remove this section is huge. Here's another one for luxury pre-runner I designed. Another one for luxury pre-runner. This was a crew cab F100, and so being able to remove this section is pretty valuable in the luxury pre-runner setting, in my opinion. So that's why I like to go with the bolt-in stuff when it comes to the luxury pre-runners, and then I like to do the weld-in stuff when it comes to the dedicated race trucks. Just to give you some variation. Now, again, Nate does his differently. Nate is still using the bolt-in stuff for his race trucks as well. So different strokes for different folks. But you'll notice there is a... And then in the past, Mason has done it too. Like Mason, this is a bolt-in section right here that they have used for shock mounts as well. So again, another example of variation in this stuff. So yeah, so there's my thoughts on bolt-in versus non-bolt-in relative to luxury pre-runners and race trucks. Bump mounts, slapper arms. Yeah, let's get into that now. So slapper arms are nothing new. They're relatively old. And so here's a Mason. Let's go review regular bumps. and their mounts, and then the slapper arm stuff. So this right here is a more traditional mount. So you can see they've got the plate work coming off, and they got support structure for this bad boy. And he contacts the top of the arm right there. So obviously he needs to be a little bit outboard to appropriately contact that arm. So this would be considered more like a traditional bump stop mount, not a slapper arm. This is a slapper arm, however. This is on Eisenhower's truck. So these bump stops look like little shocks. Let me pull up a CAD file. So I did some slapper arm stuff many years ago. This right here is on Ross King's Luxury Pre-Runner. And this is a little King slapper arm deal. So the basic concept, well, remember I was saying before, on the traditional bump stops, they contact and then they slide on the mount. And there's no way to get around that because these suspensions have that movement and that change in degrees on the arm, etc. So the bump stop is going to contact and slide. There's nothing you can do. On a slapper arm, there's no sliding. You completely eliminate that sort of, sideward leverage on the internals of the shock and during stroke, because this is a shocking basically, and the top is a shocking. So the bump stop's not hard mounted. The bump stop can swing in the chassis a little bit as it compresses, and the slapper arm basically solid locates onto the arm. And in this scenario, I have the slapper arm built into the upper arm, and he is contacting with this little blue thing is basically a Delrin piece that goes on the bottom of this, and he contacts this pad right here, and then it compresses the bump stop, and it's called a slapper arm. And it's nothing new. I did this, I've done these well over a decade ago, but I'm not the first to do this, so don't think that I invented this shit or anything. And this slapper arm right here is like thin as fuck material. It's like 045 4130. They don't need to be very strong because all they're really doing is just helping him locate onto this arm, and then the bump stop is taking all that force up and down. And so that's the basic concept of a slapper arm, is it removes that sliding effect of a traditional bump stop onto the arm, so to speak. And it also is really cool in the fact that when it's done in this fashion, it's tuned to where it consistently hits the exact spot you want it to on the upper arm. Sometimes in the systems and the long travel stuff, etc., the way you mount the bumps and all the other bits, sometimes with tuning them and getting them set up, there's movement, and so the bump stop maybe not perfectly hitting the pad and stuff like that. It can get a little cattywampus, but in a slapper arm, it's hitting that arm in the same spot every single time, etc. And the other thing too is, because I designed a slapper arm to match perfectly at compression, this flat spot hits this flat spot. So you don't have like a bump pad just hitting a point. You're distributing the load, so to speak, evenly into that arm, and a lot better. So the argument can be made, even though more complex, it's a much better way of doing a bump stop. Now here's another way of doing a slapper arm-esque bump stop. This is on the Simon trophy truck. So this is old as fuck. Like I was saying, I'm not the first one to do this. This is the arm that's holding the sort of slapper, so to speak, and the bump stop can pivot up here, and he still runs a traditional Delrin on it, and then this arm comes up and contacts him. So you can get a good view of that. And that is that. So here's another style. This is Luke McMillan's truck. Now I've done stuff like this too, where the slapper arm is tube. Again, not bad. And then what happens here is this is a metal cup that perfectly contacts this bearing cup. Like fucking perfect. Titties, and then it rotates on the slapper arm. So just a different way of doing it. Again, you can see it right here. This is that machine cup, so to speak, to match the bearing cup with the pivoting little bump stop shock-esque deal, because the ends look more like a shock even though it's a bump stop. So it doesn't look like a traditional bump stop. I'll get into those in a second. Eisenhower Brothers, here's a good picture of theirs. It's done in a similar fashion where this is a machine part that matches the bearing cup. Pretty fucking cool. Again, they did theirs out of tube as well. I do like this. I'm a big fan of the slapper arms. Here's an Arciero one. Again, it's set up to where he hits the top of this arm, and he can pivot and rotate. So again, you eliminate all that side load bullshit on the arm itself. This is a traditional bump stop mount, so this is not a slapper arm. It's just outboard, very outboard mount. Now let's go into like what Camber has been doing recently. They're putting these little miniature slapping arms onto their Raptor long travel kits. And although, like I said before, I'm not a big fan of having too much stroke shown if you're mounting the bump coming off the lower arm, this is not necessarily a bad way of doing it because it avoids all the bullshit with, the slapper scrubbing on the arm. So this is pretty cool. I do think it's rad. It is a Darwin pad, so to speak, that contacts the arm and then initiates the compression on the bump. But yeah, so again, another way of doing a mini slapper arm on a fucking long travel setup. That's pretty rad. And I'd say, my favorite is going to be in this sort of format where we're going off the upper arm on these big trucks. Like if I was doing a personal pre-runner, that's how I would do it. We do have a race truck right now we're doing that with as well, putting a slapper arm on it in the same fashion. But yeah, this is just another way of doing this type of stuff. And that's slapper arms, So again, different strokes, different folks. Some guys run them, some guys don't. But yeah. And then real quick, let's go over compression with ground clearance and the shocks. I just had a note in here to review that because I don't think I touched on that too much before. Here we go. So when you have a suspension fully compressed, you're going to have a variance between this number here and this number on the tire here. And there's always a lot of questions in how much, how little do you want? And so I've seen stuff, and so keep in mind that on this ground clearance at compression thing, you have to keep in mind the tire is going to have squish in it. Remember how I was talking about the squish has to be factored in when you're calculating your scrub numbers from your inclination and things like that? Well, this is no different. You have to have this factored into the equation as well because the tire at full compression has all that fucking weight on it. It's going to squish several inches. So the general rule of thumb that we use for the most part in the computer is about 4 or 5 inches in this range, or maybe 3 on the low side. So then it would be closer to almost 0 if the tire squishes 3 inches. But at like 5 inches with 2.5 or 3 inches of squish, you're really down to 2.5 or 2 inches. You see what I'm going with that? So you just have to understand that a general rule of thumb would be like 3, 4, 5 inches. Now I have seen guys go as low as like 2 inches and the tire can squish a bunch and almost be negative. I have seen that happen, and I have seen guys go more than that. Some of the UTVs are like really fucking bad. They're like basically fucking negative. And now this is only pertaining to the front end because there are arguments for having the rear go negative as well. And I do know some guys that have done that too. And there are some drivers that set their, builders that set cars up like that too. But the point being is for the front end, a general rule of thumb would be 3 on the low side, 5 on the high side. That's like a good range to be in ground clearance wise at full compression with your designated tire. In this specific scenario, this tire shown, I believe, is a 42, but this chassis is also set up for a 40. So right now it's shown to be like a 5-inch, which, on a 40, it's technically like a 4-inch. You see where I'm going with that? So like that tire change is changing our ground clearance at compression as well. So keep in mind that you have to factor in if you may change tire size in the lower direction, i.e. I designed the truck for 42s, but I may run 40s, or I designed it for 40s, I may run 39s or 37s. You need to make sure that if you still want to have 3 inches after a squish, that you factor that into the equation just to be safe. So those are some generalities that we set stuff up to. And I'm sure you'll find other guys that run a little bit lower and some guys that may run a little higher. But 3 to 5 is a normal range for the vast majority of trucks in this little compression dealio. So now, that pretty much concludes the shock stuff for now. The shock bump layout stuff. Let's see where we're at. We're at 2 fucking hours. Rad. I had a feeling this was going to take some time. Now let's go into real quick vertical and horizontal bearing setups and arms. We're just going to push through. And these things are getting very long with these podcasts. Where did I put those? Let's see here. Cool. Horizontal bearing setups. Vertical bearing setups. Cool. Okay. So let's dive into this. And there's some debate in this. I had some questions. Horizontal versus vertical bearings for the arms. This setup right here is a stage 2 setup that I do sell designs to. These are vertical bearings. So the bearings themselves are vertical in the upright. This is also a stage 1 setup where the bearings are vertical in the upright. This is a T4 trophy truck setup. The bearings are horizontal. So now let's go through some pluses and minuses of both setups. Let's start with vertical. For vertical bearing setups, I feel like, one, the arms are easier to make, typically speaking. Like in these plasma table friendly ones, I can really make these arms super fucking simple because they're just straight from the bearing to the pivot. Cake. 2, the uprights are easier to make as well. And there is some argument that you could get away with uprights that don't necessarily need an upright fixture. So we have seen that too. And we do that with like our plasma table friendly type stuff. So when it comes to making stuff in an easier fashion, going vertical bearings is definitely easier for fabrication wise and design wise to some degree. So there's one trade-off right there. Then the other thing too is you have to keep in mind that on the vertical bearing stuff, you are limited on turning radius because you're going to max out that bearing at some point. And depending on where your spacers are designed, you're going to be in the 30s range, low 30s range of turning degree, depending on bearing and bearing spacer setup. You know, obviously smaller bearings with certain spacers are going to yield a little less. The 1.5-inch bearings with 3/4 bolt with the bigger spacers may yield a little more. And you can play and mess with that, but you're going to be in that range and you're going to have a limit at some point. There's nothing you can do to get around that. Unlike a horizontal bearing where you're spinning, in theory, you could spin 360. So there's no turning radius limitation on horizontal bearings. Now with vertical bearings, you, in theory, can cycle the suspension almost indefinitely now. Indefinitely, in theory. You can have more wheel travel because you're not worried about the spacers maxing through wheel travel. So there's your kind of trade-off, vertical to horizontal when it comes to travel and turning radius. On vertical bearings, you have a turning radius limitation, but you don't really have a travel limitation. On horizontal bearings like these, you do not have a turning radius limitation, but you will have a wheel travel limitation on the upper arm maxing out at throw on that bearing itself. So that is one thing you got to keep in mind. Now on angle cast, okay, so on the vertical stuff, there's a few ways of doing this where you can have the bearing straight to the arm. You can twist the bearing to match caster of the upright. Some guys do that, some guys don't. Or you can make the upright bolt match the angle of the bearing even with the caster built in. Or you can just have the upright straight so the bolt is slightly kicked at that caster so the spacer sits neutral at that sort of caster angle in the bearing. So you can mess with the angle of the bearings relative to the upright in vertical bearing setups. There is another thing, like if you're running a steering rack based setup and you find that at extension you can turn sharper than compression and you might have to alleviate some of the turning because of that. And this is at extension in a rack based setup. Let me pull up that real quick so you can, let me see, cycle steering. There we go. So like in this center one here, it will turn more at extension, a few more degrees than compression because inherently that's natural with extension on a rack-based truck. What happens is obviously it's going to max out the bearing spacer first on the extension side. So a trick to this is for steering rack trucks, what you can do, I don't often do this and very few people often do this. I've only seen a few guys do it. Dave Tunget has done this. I know that on like a Mango truck, I'm pretty sure. But you take that guy and you measure your turning lock at extension, turning lock at compression, and then what you'll do is you'll either take the upright and you'll twist the top of the upright with the plate work, so that the bolt relative to your steering lock is now mitigating any difference so that you can maximize your turning radius a little bit better, or you twist the bearing cup in the upper arm to maximize that. And sometimes it's like 4 degrees, sometimes it's 6 degrees, sometimes it's 7 degrees that you can maximize. So if you were really anal about it, you're going to add twist to either the upright or twist in the bearing cup to complement the turning lock at extension on a steering rack setup with vertical bearings. So there's one trick that you can deploy to get you a few more degrees of turning if you were really anal about it. Now, the downside is it does add complexity to fabricating the arm, so you can't build the arm straight, so to speak, like I have in my stage 1 stuff, like these. But the argument then is that it doesn't necessarily matter to some degree, because you still have plenty of steering in these. Like I have a bunch of guys running these, and it's totally fine. And most guys are running it just straight and degaffing anyway. So sure, there may be like 3 degrees less on the steering than if they were to gain it. But in the off-road trucks like these, like you're not really at full fucking lock very often at all. So again, the argument can be made it doesn't matter to go that extra mile. Now, if you're doing the vertical bearings with like steering swingers, you're changing the steering swinger stuff to maximize at both ends anyways. So it's pointless to some degree. To try and add that twist. It's primarily in the rack-based trucks can you help get a little bit of turning radius by complementing it at that extension side. And that's just called the twist of that. The other thing, too, is I want to go over real quick the direction of snap rings. And I have seen guys fuck this up. The latest one I saw was on the guys, what's his name? They got a Brenthal truck, but Brenthal has done this incorrectly, unfortunately, where they put the upper arm snap ring facing forward, and that is a bad idea. And what I'm referring to is this snap ring up top. So on vertical bearing setups, you want the top snap ring facing rearward in the chassis. It's very important because under heavy braking and coming into a corner, the force is going to want to rip that fucking upright forward, and it's going to want to throw that bearing through that fucking snap ring. It's significantly greater than the inverse side. So you always want your snap ring facing rearward in the chassis for the upper arm. Now for the lower arm, it's the inverse. You always want the snap ring facing forward in the chassis because forward impact on the upright, because your bearing is on center line of that hub assembly, is going to want to take the bearing inside the arm and shove that fucker rearward. So, for obvious reasons, the snap ring in the bearing cup is significantly weaker than the machined lip that's in the bearing cup. For the most part, I'm giving you a generality based on at least like the manufacturers of bearing cups that we use, et cetera, like standard stuff. There might be someone making some weird ass fucking bearing cups that I don't know about, and it's the opposite. But again, the race truck stuff you're buying, it's going to be in that direction. So, when it comes to vertical bearing setups, that's what you want to look for. At the upright, you want the snap ring facing rearward for the upper arm, forward for the lower arm. Don't fuck that up. Like I'm saying, Brenthal fucks that up. And I've seen several of their guys have all had to fix those arms. Mike Rob Fab, I think, did one not that long ago. And they know what I'm referring to. I don't know why Brenthal does that. I'm fucking lazy. I don't get it. No one said anything to him. Who knows? So now let's go to the stuff with the horizontal bearings. So like I was saying, these guys, you get plenty of turning radius. So that's no fucking problem. You don't have to worry about those at all. What you do need to worry about is through the wheel travel, you need to make sure the angle of the dangle of this fucker will match so that, you see what I'm saying? See this bearing angle, this cup angle is going to max out at compression, and it's going to max out at extension. So you're going to have an angle to that cup that's going to complement your characteristics in the suspension, your camber curve primarily, relative to your inclination, etc. So that is a very important metric. As you can see here, he's fucking maxed, bro. And then at compression, you can see that he is maxed. See, again, slapper arm. There we go. Bump stop slapper arm. This is Rock's King setup with his little King bump stop slapper arm dealios. So the battle here is you need to do your math correctly to to do that. So I like to, basically have, compression extension, check all the angles, upper arm to upright at both, and then I put the bearing cup mid-range in both of those. So it's like right in there. And I do it actually for the lower arm too. So I do it for both, so that this guy is also in the middle of that movement. And you don't necessarily need to do it for the lower arm. For the most part, the lower arm doesn't really have a limitation because the upper arm is going to yield faster rate of change in the angle of that bearing. So you're going to max out those spacers significantly faster than the lower arm. I just do it in the lower arm as well as part of like being anal about this thing needing to be fucking titties, So I want that to be done on both arms. And so I'll take compression angle upright to the arm, extension angle upright to the arm, and I'll go right in the middle of both of those. And that's how I set the angle on the cups. Now you can also go into the equation of then twisting the cup to match the caster through the travel as well. And I do that too. So this cup is actually turned to match the caster in this setup, which I believe is 10 degrees in this car, truck, whatever, race car. So looking at it head on, the cup is tilted to match the wheel travel, and looking at it from the side, it's leaned back to match the 10 degrees of caster in the upright. Again, not everyone does that. I do it because I'm a little bit more anal with that stuff on these sort of setups, and I want it to be that way. So that's just how I do it, and that's what you got to watch for when you're running the horizontal stuff, is those two aspects to it, is it's going to fuck you on one side of the table or the other. And then again, I think that horizontal bearing setups, you get the better turning radius. So I can get 5, 6, 7 degrees more turning radius, which some guys really like. In fact, we had a client, we redesigned their front end to be horizontal bearing setups for them. I don't remember who originally built the truck per se, but we did do the new setup to where we gained 5 or 6 degrees of turning radius for them, the HP Heli guys. I talked about it last video as well. And that was something that they really wanted. And you can't really do that with the vertical stuff. You're fucked because you have a limitation on the vertical bearing. Now, with that said, a horizontal 1.5-inch bearing in like the big truck stuff is still going to yield plenty of travel. You're going to be at 25 inches of wheel travel before he maxes out, typically speaking, with most setups. Now, depending on your CPTC mitigation and your camber curve, that could be lower. So again, I'm speaking in generalities, but most of the time you're going to be able to get your 24 inches of travel with decent CPCT mitigation, and you're not going to have that guy max out too bad. So you're going to be right in the good range of all of those. I do like the style of arms in this fashion too. I feel like horizontal arms are a little bit cooler to some degree. So if that's a point, but they are more difficult to build. Like they definitely require nice tooling and fixtures to properly do, because you're setting that cup at very specific angles. Whereas in the vertical stuff, you can build those arms straight and you're fine. So you can get away with a lot more leniency in some of those aspects when it comes to the vertical bearing arms. Snap ring direction of these bad boys. Again, snap ring direction on these is going to be always down. So the snap ring should always be facing down in the chassis on horizontal bearing setups. That's for the upper and the lower, just so we're clear. You want the machined lip on the top side of both bearings, both the upper and the lower. All that force is shoving it in that direction, so to speak. So that's where you want to be. Now let's talk about why most long travel kits are not in this fucking fashion, in the opposite fashion. So let's just pull up Blitzkrieg. And I am butchering his name. Jesus. Dun, dun, dun. Okay, so yeah, you can see it's vertical. And I am going to review this right now. Yeah, see, these are all vertical upper bearing pivots. We'll pick this one. So the lower is going to be horizontal, the upper is vertical. Now, in this fashion, the lower can be vertical. It's fine. Now, the reason long travel stuff typically is in this direction, where the upper arm is always going to be a vertical bearing, is because of the camber curve and wheel travel. Like I have mentioned before and highlighted many times, the long travel stuff typically has a much sharper camber curve because the upper arms are a lot shorter. So for obvious reasons, like I was just talking about, on a horizontal bearing for the upper, you're going to max out that guy pretty quickly on a long travel setup like this because of those angle changes are far more severe than a center mount truck, usually speaking. So to mitigate that, you switch to a vertical bearing. Downside is you do lose turning radius, or you're held to a certain turning radius. Not the end of the world. All long travel setups kind of have that inherently in play regardless of the scenario. So with that said, now they turn to the vertical bearing. They do not have to worry about the severe camber change limiting their wheel travel. They can start to swing this fucker as much as they want to some degree, and still yield 16, 17, 18 inches of usable wheel travel, with the mitigation on the turning radius side, which again is not the end of the world. And they end up still typically having enough turning radius to still be streetable and not terrible. But the problem is, if you weren't going to do this, they would be at like fucking 12 inches of wheel travel, 13, maybe 14 inches of wheel travel max. So for obvious reasons, that's just not going to fly in the long travel game. You want to be closer to 16 to 18. So vertical bearings it is for long travel. So this is an inherent aspect of the fact that wheel travel is the trade-off you're making for the turning radius in the long travel applications. With that said, you also have to keep in mind that that top bearing, like Nate's right here, that snap ring is also facing forward. It is the same philosophy as I was getting at before, that under braking, it wants to throw that fucking upright forward. And so again, it's the same deal as the others that I was referring to with the vertical bearings. So yeah, pal, that is episode 4. God, that took a little longer than I thought. But thank you guys for checking that out, going through this. Again, I am going to put together the some sort of web page on DIY Off-Road, I think, that will have these videos and the outlines to each video available as like a PDF format. I'll organize that shit for you guys. I know a few guys have asked. And again, no, I don't take donations or any of that shit. I believe like some guys do Patreon and other crap, and yeah, fuck all that. If you want to support us, you can just spend money on DIY Off-Road or not. Or just talk shit to your buddies. That works too, as well. And so, with that said, my name is Jason Elfherd. Thank you for watching JEHC. This is the Independent Front Suspension episode, Volume 4. And I appreciate your time. And remember, we do have billet, fucking 4130 billet link mounts. POW, available on the site. Contractual obligation, done. And as always, gentlemen, pitter patter.